The snow came down so fast that Eliza Whitmore could no longer see the road ahead of the carriage. She pressed her gloved hand against the frosted window and watched the white world spin past, faster than it should have, as the coachman fought to keep the horses steady on the icy path. Inside the carriage, her stepmother Margaret sat wrapped in a fur-lined cloak, her lips pressed into a thin line of irritation, while her stepsister Charlotte complained about the cold as though the weather itself had been arranged to inconvenience her. "We should never have left so late," Margaret said. "Not for the first time. If we are delayed, Lord Ashcombe will think us rude." "It is not my fault the weather turned," Eliza said quietly. She had learned, over the 3 years since her father's death, that it was always safer to speak softly in this carriage. Margaret did not like to be contradicted, and Charlotte enjoyed nothing more than watching her stepsister be corrected in front of others. The carriage lurched violently, and Eliza gripped the seat to keep from being thrown forward. A moment later it lurched again, then stopped altogether. Outside, she could hear the coachman shouting something to the horses, his voice half swallowed by the wind. "What is happening?" Charlotte demanded, pulling her blanket tighter. The door opened, and a blast of freezing air rushed in, along with the anxious face of Samuel, the coachman. Snow clung to his eyebrows and the collar of his coat. "Begging your pardon, my lady," he said to Margaret, "but the wheel has come loose. I cannot fix it in this storm. We will need to wait, or walk to find shelter." Margaret's expression tightened with something colder than the wind. "Walk? In this?" "It is not safe to stay here either," Samuel said. "There is a farmhouse perhaps 2 miles back, and Blackwood Hall itself may be closer, though I cannot be certain of the distance in this weather." Eliza felt a small flicker of hope. If they could reach any shelter at all, the night would not end in disaster. She began gathering her shawl around her shoulders, preparing to help however she could, when Margaret's voice cut through the howling wind. "We cannot all walk. The horses can carry 2, perhaps 3, if we leave the trunks behind." "3," Charlotte repeated. "That is myself, you, and Samuel to lead them." Eliza looked between them, waiting for someone to say her name, to include her in the count. No one did. She felt the cold settle into her chest before it ever reached her fingers. "Mother," she said carefully. "What of me?" Margaret did not meet her eyes. She was already stepping down from the carriage, taking Samuel's offered hand. "You are young and strong, Eliza. You can walk behind us. It is not far." "In this storm, I cannot see 2 feet in front of me," Eliza said, and for the first time in a long while, she let her voice rise above its usual careful quiet. "Please, let me ride with you. I will hold the trunk on my lap if I must." Charlotte laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You always find some reason to make things difficult." "I am not making anything difficult. I am asking not to be left in a snowstorm." Margaret finally turned to look at her, and there was no warmth in her face at all, only the flat, calculating look she wore whenever she spoke of Eliza's inheritance from her late father, the small sum that would come to Eliza upon her next birthday, the sum Margaret had spent 3 years trying to find a way to keep for herself. "You will manage," Margaret said. "You have always been resourceful. Follow the road. You cannot lose your way if you simply follow the road. Mother, please." But Margaret had already turned, and Samuel, though his face showed real reluctance, was following her orders, helping Charlotte onto one horse and Margaret onto the other. He glanced back at Eliza once, his mouth opening as if to argue on her behalf, but a sharp word from Margaret silenced him. "Come along, Samuel. We haven't the whole night." "I will send someone back for the young miss," Samuel called to Eliza, though his voice was already fading into the wind. "Stay near the carriage if you can." And then they were gone, swallowed by the white curtain of snow, and Eliza stood alone on the frozen road with nothing but the broken carriage, a trunk she could not carry, and a cold that seemed to reach all the way into her bones. For a long moment, she simply stood there, too stunned to move. She had known Margaret disliked her. She had known Charlotte enjoyed her small cruelties, but she had never imagined that either of them would truly leave her behind in a storm that could kill her. The wind screamed across the open fields, driving snow into her eyes until she could barely keep them open. She turned back to the carriage, thinking she might shelter inside it, but one look told her the wheel was shattered beyond any temporary use, and the carriage itself sat at an angle that let the wind pour straight through the cracked door. She had 2 choices: stay and freeze, or walk and hope to find the farmhouse Samuel had mentioned, or perhaps this Blackwood Hall he had spoken of. She chose to walk. The snow came up over the tops of her boots within the first few minutes, soaking through the thin leather and numbing her feet almost instantly. She pulled her shawl tighter and bent her head against the wind, trying to keep to what she hoped was the road, though every direction looked the same now, an endless white nothing, broken only by the black shapes of bare trees. She thought of her father as she walked, the way he used to tell her that courage was not the absence of fear but the choice to keep moving despite it. She had been 11 years old when he died, and in the years since, she had needed that lesson more times than she could count. She needed it now more than ever. Her legs ached, her lungs burned with each breath of frozen air. She lost track of how long she had been walking, whether it had been 20 minutes or 2 hours, because the storm had erased every marker of time. The light was fading now too, the gray afternoon sliding into a deeper, more dangerous gray that would soon become full darkness. She stumbled once, twice, and the second time she did not manage to catch herself. She fell into a drift at the edge of the road, and for a moment, the cold did not feel painful anymore. It felt strangely soft, almost warm, and she understood with a distant, floating kind of clarity that this was a very bad sign. "Get up," she told herself. "If you stop now, you will not start again." She pushed herself up on shaking arms and forced herself back onto her feet, though her body screamed in protest. She kept walking. She did not know where she was going anymore. She only knew that stopping meant something she was not ready to accept. The trees along the road began to thin, and through the driving snow she thought she saw a shape ahead, tall and dark against the white. She blinked hard, certain her mind was inventing shelter out of desperation, but the shape did not disappear. It grew larger as she stumbled toward it, resolving slowly into the outline of a great stone gatepost, and beyond it, the suggestion of a long drive lined with trees. Hope gave her one last burst of strength. She pushed forward, gripping the cold stone of the gatepost as if it were a living thing that might steady her, and then her legs simply stopped obeying her. She sank down against the base of the gatepost, her vision narrowing at the edges, the roar of the wind fading into something distant and unimportant. She was aware, in a vague and disconnected way, of the snow settling over her shoulders, over her hair, over her hands, until she was no longer certain where her own body ended and the storm began. She thought, with the last clear thought she had, that no one was coming for her after all. Somewhere far off, though she could not have said how far, a horse's hooves struck against the frozen ground, fast and urgent, cutting through the howl of the wind like something that did not belong to the storm at all, something with purpose. But by then, Eliza Whitmore's eyes had already closed, and the white world had gone silent and dark around her. Duke Alistair Blackwood had ridden through worse storms than this one, though not often, and never willingly. Tonight, he had little choice. A letter had arrived that morning from his estate manager at the far edge of his land, warning that the river near the Tennant Farms was rising fast with the melting snow from the hills, and that the old bridge might not survive another night of this weather. If the bridge failed, 3 farming families would be cut off from the main road for weeks, perhaps longer, in the dead of winter. He had ordered his horse saddled within the hour and set out alone, ignoring his steward's protests that he ought to send a man in his place, that a duke had no business riding through a storm like some tenant farmer chasing a fence post. Alistair had simply pulled on his riding gloves and said that he preferred to see the danger himself before deciding what needed to be done, and that had been the end of the conversation. It was, if he were honest with himself, easier to be out here in the cold and the wind than to sit inside Blackwood Hall with nothing but his own thoughts for company. The great house had felt too quiet for the better part of 2 years now, ever since the accident that had taken his brother Edward, and Alistair had found that motion, purpose, even discomfort, were easier to bear than stillness. The wind had grown worse since he left, and the light was failing faster than he had expected. He had seen to the bridge, ordered his men to reinforce it with timber before the night was through, and was now making his way back toward the hall, keeping to the road as best he could through the blinding snow. His horse, a steady gray gelding named Pharaoh, picked his way carefully over the icy ground, ears flicking with the same wariness Alistair felt in his own chest. It was the gatepost that caught his eye first, the tall stone marker at the edge of his own land, half buried already in drifting snow. And then, at its base, a shape that did not belong there, a dark huddle against the white, unmoving. For one terrible moment, Alistair thought it was an animal, perhaps a sheep that had wandered from a tenant's field and collapsed in the cold. But as Pharaoh drew closer, snorting uneasily, the shape resolved into something far worse. A person. A young woman, from what he could see of her, curled against the stone with snow gathering on her still form. He swung down from the saddle before he had fully decided to do so, his boots sinking into the drift as he crossed the last few feet to her side. Up close, the sight was worse than he had feared. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint, her skin was pale as the snow itself, and when he pressed 2 fingers to her throat, searching for a pulse, he found it faint and slow, but present. "Can you hear me?" he said, his voice sharp with urgency, though she did not stir. Miss, can you hear me?" Nothing, only the wind answering him, and the small cloud of her breath, barely visible, rising and falling with agonizing slowness. Alistair did not waste time considering what a duke ought to do, or what would be proper, or what his steward would say if he could see him now. He simply acted, the way he had learned to act in every crisis since Edward's death, with cold efficiency that left no room for hesitation. He stripped off his own greatcoat and wrapped it around her, tucking it beneath her as best he could to shield her from the snow beneath as well as above. Then he lifted her from the ground, and was startled by how light she felt, how thin beneath the layers of her soaked traveling dress. "Foolish girl," he muttered, though there was no real anger in the words, only the rough edge of fear he refused to name. "What were you doing out here alone?" He carried her to Pharaoh and managed, with some difficulty, to settle her in front of the saddle before mounting behind her, one arm wrapped securely around her still form to keep her from sliding. She did not wake, did not so much as murmur, and that silence frightened him more than any amount of struggling would have. "Stay with me," he said, low, more to himself than to her. "We are nearly there." The ride back to Blackwood Hall felt longer than any journey he could remember, though in truth it could not have been more than 15 minutes. He pushed Pharaoh as hard as he dared through the storm, watching the woman's pale face for any sign of movement, any flicker of awareness, and finding none. By the time the great dark shape of the hall rose out of the snow ahead of them, windows glowing warm and gold against the storm, his jaw had gone tight with a tension that had nothing to do with the cold. He shouted for help before he had even fully dismounted, and the household staff, well-trained and unshakable after years of service, responded within moments. Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper, appeared on the front steps with a lamp held high, her expression shifting from surprise to alarm as she took in the sight of her master carrying a half-frozen stranger through the storm. "Your Grace, what has happened?" "Found her on the road, near the north gate," Alistair said, striding past her into the entrance hall, snow falling from his shoulders onto the polished floor. "She is barely breathing. Send for Dr. Whitfield at once, and have a room prepared, and hot water, and blankets. Now, Mrs. Fenwick, please." The housekeeper did not waste a moment on further questions. She turned and began issuing orders to the small army of servants who had gathered at the sound of the commotion, her voice crisp and calm despite the strangeness of the situation. Alistair carried Eliza up the wide staircase himself, refusing to hand her off to anyone else until she was safely settled. He laid her on the bed in one of the guest chambers, and stood back only when Mrs. Fenwick and 2 maids moved in to begin the work of warming her, of stripping away the soaked dress and wrapping her in dry blankets, of rubbing warmth back into her hands and feet. He should have left the room. It was not his place to remain while the women tended to her, and he knew it, but something kept his boots rooted to the floor near the door, some need to see with his own eyes that she would live before he allowed himself to walk away. "Her breathing is stronger already, Your Grace," Mrs. Fenwick said, glancing back at him with an expression he could not quite read. "The doctor will know more when he arrives, but I believe you found her in time." "Good," Alistair said, and the single word carried more relief than he intended to show. He cleared his throat and straightened, reaching for the cold formality that had become as familiar to him as his own name. "See that she has everything she needs. I will be in my study." He left the room before anyone could see whatever expression had settled on his face, and made his way down the corridor with quick, hard strides, as though he could outrun the strange, unsettled feeling that had taken root in his chest the moment he had found her in the snow. It was only much later, alone in his study with a glass of brandy he did not drink, and a fire he barely noticed, that he allowed himself to wonder who she was, and why anyone would have left a young woman alone on a road in the middle of a storm like this one. The thought sat uneasily with him, gathering weight the longer he turned it over in his mind. Whoever she was, someone had abandoned her to die in the cold, and Alistair Blackwood, who had spent 2 years teaching himself not to care about anything too deeply, found that this particular thought made something old and buried stir back to life inside him, something that felt dangerously close to anger. Dr. Whitfield arrived within the hour, shaking snow from his coat in the entrance hall, before being shown upstairs. Alistair waited in the corridor outside the guest chamber, arms crossed, refusing to admit even to himself why he had not simply gone to bed and left the matter to his staff. When the doctor finally emerged, his expression was cautiously optimistic. "She will live, Your Grace," he said. It was a near thing. Another hour in that cold, and I do not think we would be having this conversation. She is young and, I suspect, stronger than she looks. She should wake by morning, though she will be weak for some days after. Thank you, doctor, Alistair said, and found that he meant it more than he expected to. He did not go to bed that night, not for many hours. Instead, he found himself standing at the window of his study, watching the storm rage on outside, thinking of the strange, cold weight of a stranger in his arms, and wondering what manner of story had led a young woman to be found half dead at the edge of his land, with no one in the world who had thought to look for her. Eliza woke to warmth, and for a long moment she could not understand where she was. The bed beneath her was softer than any she had known since her father's death, the sheets crisp and clean, and a fire crackled somewhere nearby, filling the room with a golden light that felt almost unreal after the endless white of the storm. She lay still, blinking up at an unfamiliar ceiling painted with faint gold patterns, and tried to piece together how she had come to be here. Memory returned slowly, and with it, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The carriage, the broken wheel, Margaret's flat refusal to make room for her, the long, desperate walk through the snow, and the moment her legs had finally given out beneath her. She should be dead. She understood that with sudden, sharp clarity. She should have died on that road, and yet here she was, warm and alive in a bed she did not recognize, in a house she had never seen. "You are awake," said a voice from the doorway, and Eliza turned her head to find an older woman watching her with an expression of careful relief. The woman wore the dark dress and keys of a housekeeper, and her face, though lined with years of service, held genuine kindness. "How are you feeling, my dear? Can you tell me your name?" "Eliza," she managed, her voice rough and unfamiliar in her own ears. "Eliza Whitmore. Where am I?" "You are at Blackwood Hall," the housekeeper said, moving into the room to check the fire and pour a cup of something warm from a pot near the hearth. "I am Mrs. Fenwick. His Grace the Duke found you near the north gate last night, half frozen in the snow. Another hour out there, the doctor said, and you would not have survived it." Blackwood Hall. Eliza had heard the name before, whispered among the ladies at the last assembly she had attended with her stepmother, always followed by some remark about the cold and reclusive Duke who had inherited the estate after his brother's death, who never danced, never smiled, and never seemed to want for anything except to be left entirely alone. "The Duke found me," Eliza repeated, trying to make sense of it. "He carried you here himself," Mrs. Fenwick said, handing her the warm cup, which turned out to be a rich honeyed tea that Eliza drank gratefully. "Would not leave your side until the doctor confirmed you would live, though he would deny it if you asked him directly, I imagine." Eliza did not know what to say to that. The idea of the cold, distant Duke of local gossip carrying a stranger through a storm did not match anything she had heard about him. "My family," Eliza said suddenly, sitting up too quickly and feeling the room tilt slightly around her. "My stepmother and stepsister. They were traveling with me. They will not know where I am. They will be worried." Something flickered across Mrs. Fenwick's face, quickly hidden, but not quickly enough for Eliza to miss it entirely. "His Grace has already sent word to the Ashcombe estate, where I understand your family was expected. I am certain they will be relieved to hear you are safe." Eliza settled back against the pillows, though the small hesitation in the housekeeper's voice left an uneasy feeling in her chest. She did not think Margaret would be relieved. She thought Margaret would be surprised, and perhaps even a little disappointed, though she pushed that thought away before it could take root too deeply. It was an unkind thing to think of one's own stepmother, even if it was true. "You should rest," Mrs. Fenwick said, drawing the blankets up around her. "I will have a tray brought up, something light for your stomach after such a shock to your body. The doctor says you must not exert yourself for a few days yet." "Thank you," Eliza said, "for everything. I do not know how to repay such kindness." "You need not repay anything, my dear. Get well. That is all that is asked of you." After Mrs. Fenwick left, Eliza lay in the quiet room for a long while, watching the fire and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. She was alive, in the home of a duke she had never met, cared for by strangers who had shown her more warmth in a single night than her own family had shown her in years. It felt like something out of a story, too strange and fortunate to be entirely real. She did not see the Duke that first day, though she thought she heard his voice once in the corridor outside her room, low and clipped as he spoke with Mrs. Fenwick about something she could not make out. It was not until the second day, when Dr. Whitfield had declared her well enough to sit up and take a little exercise about the room, that she finally met him properly. She was standing at the window, watching the snow-covered gardens below, when the door opened and a tall man entered without ceremony, his dark hair slightly disheveled, his expression as guarded as any she had ever seen. He stopped a few paces inside the room, as though uncertain whether he had made a mistake in coming at all. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice formal, almost stiff, "I am glad to see you recovering." "Your Grace." Eliza dropped into a curtsy, though her legs still felt unsteady beneath her. "I understand I owe you my life. I do not know how to thank you properly." "You owe me nothing," he said, a little too quickly, as though the gratitude itself made him uncomfortable. Any decent person would have done the same. Eliza studied him for a moment, taking in the tension in his shoulders, the careful distance he kept, even while standing still in the middle of the room. This was not a man accustomed to warmth, or perhaps not a man who allowed himself to accept it easily. "Not every person would have ridden through a storm to find a stranger," she said quietly. "I know how close I came to not waking at all." Something shifted behind his eyes, brief and unreadable, before the guarded expression settled back into place. "I would ask, if you are able to speak of it, how you came to be alone on that road in such weather." Eliza hesitated. The truth felt too raw, too shameful to speak aloud to a stranger, even one who had saved her life. But something in his steady, patient gaze made her feel that lying, or softening the truth, would be an insult to what he had done for her. "Our carriage broke down in the storm," she said carefully. "My stepmother and stepsister chose to ride ahead on the horses, to seek shelter. There was not room for all of us. I was told to follow on foot." The Duke's expression did not change, but something in the room seemed to grow colder, sharper, as though the words themselves had struck a nerve. "They left you," he said, not as a question. "They believed I would manage," Eliza said, though even as she spoke the words she heard how thin they sounded, how much they resembled an excuse she was making on behalf of people who had offered none for themselves. "In a storm like that one, no one manages alone," Alistair said, and there was an edge to his voice now, something hard and controlled that made Eliza wonder, not for the first time, what lay beneath his cold reputation. "You very nearly did not survive it." "I am aware," Eliza said softly. He seemed to catch himself then, the sharpness fading back into careful neutrality, and he inclined his head slightly. "Forgive me. It is not my place to speak of your family's choices. I only meant to say that you are safe here, for as long as you require, until arrangements can be made for your return." "Thank you, Your Grace." He turned to leave, then paused at the door, glancing back at her with an expression that was almost, though not quite, curious. "You are stronger than you look, Miss Whitmore. Most would not have made it as far as that gatepost." Then he was gone, and Eliza was left alone with the fire and the snow beyond the window, turning his words over in her mind long after the sound of his footsteps had faded down the corridor. Over the following days, as her strength slowly returned, Eliza began to piece together more of Blackwood Hall and its master. From the servants, who spoke of him with a loyalty that surprised her given his reputation among the local gentry, she learned that the Duke had lost his elder brother Edward 2 years before, in a riding accident on the estate's own grounds, and that something in him had gone quiet and distant ever since, as though he had decided that caring deeply about anything only invited loss. She learned too, though this came from a careless remark by one of the younger maids, quickly hushed by an older servant, that Lady Beatrice Sinclair, a wealthy and well-connected widow from a neighboring estate, had set her sights on the Duke some months before, and made frequent visits to Blackwood Hall, under the thinnest of social pretenses, always finding some new reason to call. Eliza thought little of this at first. It was no concern of hers who the Duke chose to marry, or why. She was a guest here by chance and misfortune, nothing more, and she intended to return to her own life the moment she was strong enough to travel, however unwelcome that return might prove to be. But as the days passed, and she found herself sharing quiet meals with Alistair in the smaller dining room, or crossing paths with him in the library where she had taken to reading in the long, snowbound afternoons, she began to notice things she had not expected. The way his guarded expression eased, just slightly, when he did not think anyone was watching, the unexpected dry humor that surfaced now and then, quickly suppressed as though he had caught himself doing something forbidden. The careful, deliberate kindness he showed the household staff, even as he kept the rest of the world at arm's length. She began, despite every instinct telling her not to wonder what it would take to see past the ice to whatever lay beneath it. And she did not yet know that Lady Beatrice Sinclair had already begun asking pointed questions in the village about the strange young woman who had taken up residence at Blackwood Hall, or that those questions, in time, would prove far more dangerous than any storm. The storm broke on the 4th day, giving way to a bright, hard winter sun that turned the snow-covered grounds of Blackwood Hall into something almost blinding to look at. Eliza, growing restless after days confined to her room in the library, asked Mrs. Fenwick if she might be permitted to walk in the gardens, and was pleasantly surprised when the housekeeper agreed without hesitation, so long as she wrapped herself warmly and did not stay out too long. She was standing near the frozen fountain at the center of the garden, watching her breath fog in the cold air, when she heard footsteps crunching through the snow behind her. She turned to find Alistair approaching, dressed for riding, though he slowed his pace when he saw her. "Miss Whitmore, I did not expect to find you outdoors so soon." Mrs. Fenwick permitted it, Eliza said. "I could not bear another day indoors, however grateful I am for the shelter." Something that might almost have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth, there and gone so quickly she nearly missed it. "The gardens are pleasant enough in summer. In winter, I confess, most people find them rather bleak." "I do not mind bleak," Eliza said, looking out over the frozen fountain and the skeletal shapes of the rose bushes beneath their blanket of snow. "There is a kind of honesty to it, nothing pretending to be more than it is." He was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite name. "That is an unusual way to look at a garden in winter." "Perhaps I have had cause to appreciate honesty more than most," Eliza said, and regretted the words the instant they left her mouth, too close to bitterness for comfort. She glanced away, embarrassed. "Forgive me. That was not meant as a complaint." "You need not apologize for speaking honestly in my presence," Alistair said, and there was something quieter in his voice now, something that sounded almost like an invitation. "I have found that most people say only what they believe I wish to hear. It grows tiresome." Eliza looked at him then, really looked, and saw beneath the cold formality something tired and a little lonely, a man who had built high walls around himself and had perhaps begun to wonder, in unguarded moments, whether he had built them too high. "Then I will try to remain honest," she said, "even if it proves inconvenient." "I would prefer that," he said, and for a moment, standing there in the winter sunlight with the snow crunching softly beneath their boots, something passed between them that neither of them was quite ready to name. It was Alistair who broke the silence first, clearing his throat and glancing toward the stables. "I am riding out to the Tennant Farms this morning, to check on the bridge repairs from the storm. Would you care to walk with me as far as the stables?" "The exercise may do you good, so long as you do not overtire yourself," Eliza agreed, and they walked together through the crisp winter air, talking of small things at first, the state of the roads, the mildness of the sun despite the cold, and then, gradually, of larger things. He asked, carefully, about her father, and she found herself telling him more than she had told anyone in years, about the quiet man who had taught her to read the stars, and to always choose kindness even when it cost her something, and about the long, cold years since his death, living in a house that had never felt like home. He listened in a way that surprised her, without the polite impatience she had grown used to from Margaret and Charlotte whenever she spoke of her father, as though her grief were an inconvenience to be endured rather than understood. "He sounds as though he was a good man," Alistair said quietly, when she had finished. "He was the best man I have known," Eliza said. Then, before she could stop herself, she added, "Until now, perhaps." The words hung in the cold air between them, and Eliza felt her cheeks flush despite the chill. Alistair did not answer immediately, and when she glanced at him, she found him watching her with an expression that was neither guarded nor cold, but something far more difficult to define. "I am not a good man, Miss Whitmore," he said finally, his voice low. "I am a man who has learned to protect what remains of himself by wanting very little from the world. It is not the same thing." "I think," Eliza said carefully, "that a man who rides through a storm to save a stranger, and who listens to that stranger speak of her grief without growing impatient, is closer to good than he believes himself to be." He did not answer that, though something in his expression softened further, and they walked the rest of the way to the stables in a silence that felt far less empty than the silences she had grown used to at home. That evening, at dinner, Mrs. Fenwick informed them both that Lady Beatrice Sinclair had sent word she intended to call the following afternoon, along with her brother Lord Edmund, ostensibly to inquire after the Duke's welfare following the storm, though Eliza noticed the slight tightening around Alistair's mouth at the news, and suspected the visit had rather less to do with concern for his welfare than Beatrice's letter suggested. "You need not join us, if you would prefer to rest," Alistair said to Eliza, once Mrs. Fenwick had left the room. "Lady Beatrice can be, at times, rather particular in her opinions." "I would not wish to be a burden on your household during a social call," Eliza said, though something in his careful phrasing made her curious about exactly what sort of particular opinions he meant. She found out the following afternoon, when Lady Beatrice Sinclair swept into the drawing room in a gown far too fine for a simple country visit, followed by her brother, a slight, sharp-eyed man who seemed to spend most of his time watching rather than speaking. Beatrice was beautiful in a polished, deliberate way, every gesture calculated for maximum effect, and her eyes found Eliza within moments of entering the room, sweeping over her plain borrowed dress with an assessment so swift and thorough that Eliza felt herself weighed and dismissed in the space of a single glance. "Your Grace, I was so relieved to hear you weathered the storm without incident," Beatrice said, settling herself onto the settee with practiced grace, close enough to Alistair that Eliza noted the deliberate placement. "Though I understand you had rather more excitement than the rest of us." "A rescue, I am told." "Miss Whitmore was in some difficulty on the road," Alistair said, his voice carefully neutral. "I am glad I found her in time." Beatrice's gaze swung back to Eliza, sweet and sharp all at once. "How very fortunate for you, Miss Whitmore." "I confess I had not heard the name Whitmore before." "You are not, I think, from any family I am familiar with in this county." "My family is not from this county, Lady Beatrice," Eliza said evenly, refusing to be cowed by the woman's obvious probing. "We were traveling to Ashcombe Park when the storm caught us." "Ah, the Ashcombes. And yet here you remain, some days later, a guest in a bachelor's household." Beatrice's smile did not waver, but her voice had taken on an edge sharp enough to cut. "How very unusual an arrangement." "I do hope, for your sake, that no unkind talk arises from it. The county can be rather unforgiving of such things, whatever the innocent circumstances." Eliza felt the threat beneath the honeyed words as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud, and glanced at Alistair, who had gone very still, his jaw tight. "Miss Whitmore remains under my protection until she is well enough to travel and her family can be properly informed of her whereabouts," Alistair said, his voice carrying a cold precision that made even Lord Edmund glance up from whatever he had been studying in the corner of the room. "I trust no one in this county would be foolish enough to suggest impropriety in offering shelter to a woman who nearly died in a storm." Beatrice's smile tightened, just slightly, before smoothing back into its practiced pleasantness. "Of course not, Your Grace. I only meant to offer a friendly caution, for Miss Whitmore's own sake." The visit continued for a further half hour, filled with the kind of polite, barbed conversation that left Eliza's shoulders aching with tension by the time Beatrice and her brother finally departed. As their carriage pulled away down the long drive, Alistair turned to Eliza with an expression of quiet apology. "I am sorry for that. Lady Beatrice has a talent for making her displeasure sound like concern." "She does not want me here," Eliza said simply. "She wants a great many things she is unlikely to have," Alistair said, and there was something in his tone that told Eliza, without needing further explanation, exactly what those things were. That night, alone in her room, Eliza thought of Beatrice's sharp smile and sharper words, and understood, with a sinking certainty, that her brief, fragile peace at Blackwood Hall would not go unchallenged for long. Word of Eliza's continued stay at Blackwood Hall reached Margaret Whitmore 3 days after Lady Beatrice's visit, and it arrived not as relief at her stepdaughter's survival, but as a carefully worded letter demanding Eliza's immediate return to the family, delivered by a messenger who had ridden hard from Ashcombe Park. Eliza read the letter twice in the privacy of her room, searching in vain for even a single line that acknowledged how close she had come to dying, or expressed gratitude to the man who had saved her. There was none, only cold instruction, demanding she return at once, and a barely concealed undertone of something that read, to Eliza's practiced eye, less like concern and more like alarm. She understood why only when she reached the final paragraph, where Margaret noted, with careful casualness, that it would not do for people to speculate about Eliza's extended stay in a bachelor's household, particularly given her upcoming birthday and the small inheritance that would soon come under her own control. Any hint of scandal, Margaret wrote, could jeopardize the family's standing at a delicate time. Eliza set the letter down with hands that trembled, not from cold this time, but from a cold, clear understanding. Margaret's concern was not for her stepdaughter's welfare, nor even truly for the family's reputation. It was for the inheritance and the fear that scandal might somehow interfere with whatever plans Margaret had quietly been forming to keep that money within her own reach. She brought the letter to Alistair that evening, uncertain why she felt the need to share it with him, only that she trusted his judgment more than she trusted her own in that moment. He read it in silence, his expression growing darker with each line, and when he finished, he set it aside with a controlled precision that spoke more of restrained anger than any outburst could have. "She does not ask if you are well," he said, not once, in the entire letter. "No," Eliza agreed quietly. "She does not." "You need not return to that house if you do not wish it," Alistair said. "You are of an age to make your own decisions, and Blackwood Hall will provide whatever shelter you require, for as long as you require it. Eliza looked at him, startled by the offer, by the quiet certainty in his voice. Your Grace, I cannot ask that of you. It would only give Lady Beatrice and others exactly the scandal my stepmother fears. Let them speculate, Alistair said, an edge of something fierce entering his voice that she had not heard from him before. I find I care rather less for what people speculate than I once believed I did. The words settled into the quiet room like something significant, and Eliza felt her heart quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. But before she could answer, a knock came at the door, and Mrs. Fenwick entered with an expression of poorly concealed alarm. Your Grace, forgive the interruption. Lady Beatrice has called again, and she has brought Mrs. Whitmore with her. Eliza's stomach dropped. My stepmother is here? In the drawing room, my dear, along with Miss Charlotte, Mrs. Fenwick confirmed. Lady Beatrice offered to bring them, given that she was traveling this way regardless. Eliza understood at once what this meant. Beatrice had not offered out of kindness. She had orchestrated this visit, bringing Margaret directly to Blackwood Hall to create precisely the kind of confrontation that would serve her own purposes, whatever those purposes truly were. Alistair rose, his expression settling into the cold, controlled mask Eliza had first met on her second day at the hall. Then let us not keep them waiting. They entered the drawing room together, and Eliza felt the weight of every eye turned toward her the moment she crossed the threshold. Margaret sat stiffly on the settee beside Beatrice, her expression a careful arrangement of relief and reproach, while Charlotte stood near the window, arms crossed, watching Eliza with an expression that held no relief at all, only calculation. Eliza, Margaret said, rising with theatrical warmth that did not reach her eyes. Thank heaven you are well. We have been so worried. Have you? Eliza said, and though she kept her voice level, she did not soften the words with any pretense of gratitude for a concern she knew to be false. Margaret's smile flickered, just slightly, before she turned to Alistair with a deep, grateful curtsy. Your Grace, I cannot thank you enough for what you have done for my stepdaughter. We are forever in your debt. Your gratitude is unnecessary, Alistair said, his voice carrying an edge sharp enough that even Margaret seemed to feel it, her smile faltering further. I would ask only that you explain to me, if you are able, why a young woman was left alone on an open road in the middle of a storm severe enough to have killed her. The room went very still. Beatrice's eyes gleamed with barely concealed interest, watching the exchange with the focus of a woman gathering ammunition for later use. Charlotte's arms tightened across her chest, and Margaret's composure cracked, just slightly, before she smoothed it back into place. There was no room in the carriage for all of us, Your Grace, Margaret said carefully. It was a difficult decision, made under great duress. I assure you, we did not intend for any harm to come to her. You intended for her to walk, alone, through a blizzard, while you and your daughter rode ahead to safety, Alistair said, each word measured and precise as a blade. I am struggling to understand what outcome you did intend, if not harm. Margaret's face flushed, whether with shame or anger Eliza could not tell. Your Grace, I do not think it is your place to judge a family's private decisions. It became my place the moment I found her dying in the snow at the edge of my own land, Alistair said, and the cold finality in his voice left no room for further argument. Beatrice, sensing perhaps that the conversation was moving in a direction she had not fully anticipated, leaned forward with a look of practiced concern. Your Grace, I understand your compassion for Miss Whitmore, truly, but you must see how this appears. A young, unmarried woman, residing here for the better part of a week, unchaperoned. Whatever the circumstances of her arrival, surely for her own reputation's sake, she ought to return to her family now that she is recovered. Eliza felt every eye in the room turned to her again, and understood, with sudden clarity, that this was the moment Beatrice had engineered from the start. Force Eliza into a corner where she must either return to a household that had abandoned her, or remain and be branded with scandal that would follow her for the rest of her life. She opened her mouth to speak, uncertain even now what she intended to say, when Alistair's voice cut through the tension first, low and absolutely certain. Miss Whitmore will remain at Blackwood Hall for as long as she wishes to remain, he said, and any talk of scandal that arises from an act of common decency reflects rather more poorly on those who spread it than on the woman it concerns. Margaret's face had gone pale, and Charlotte's mouth had fallen open in an expression of genuine shock. Beatrice, for her part, recovered her composure quickly, though something colder had entered her gaze, something that told Eliza this was far from the last confrontation they would have. Of course, Your Grace, Beatrice said smoothly. I only wish to be helpful. Your helpfulness is noted, Alistair said, in a tone that made it clear exactly how little value he placed on it. Margaret gathered herself with visible effort, offering one final brittle attempt at reconciliation. Eliza, dear, will you not at least come home for a few days, to reassure the family of your safety? We could return together, and revisit the question of your future arrangements once matters have settled. Eliza looked at her stepmother, at the careful performance of concern that could not quite hide the calculation beneath it, and felt something in her that had bent under Margaret's authority for 3 long years finally straighten. I do not believe I will, Mother, she said quietly. I think I will remain here, where I am safe. The silence that followed felt heavier than any storm, and Eliza understood, watching the fury flicker briefly across Margaret's carefully composed face before being smoothed away again, that she had just made an enemy far more dangerous than any storm could ever be. 2 weeks passed before the county's midwinter assembly, an event held each year at the grand house of Lord and Lady Pemberton, and one that no family of standing would think of missing. Eliza had hoped, quietly, that she might avoid it altogether, given the whispers that had already begun to circulate about her extended stay at Blackwood Hall. But Alistair had insisted, with a quiet firmness that left little room for argument, that hiding away would only lend weight to whatever rumors Beatrice and her allies chose to spread. If you do not appear, he told her, as they stood together in the entrance hall, waiting for the carriage to be brought around, they will say you are ashamed, or that you have something to hide. Neither is true, and I will not have you made to feel otherwise. Eliza smoothed the skirt of the deep blue gown Mrs. Fenwick had helped her select, a gown far finer than anything she had owned in years, a gift from Alistair that she had accepted only after considerable protest. And if they say worse things to my face, then they will answer to me, Alistair said simply, and something in the flat certainty of his voice settled the nervous flutter in her chest, at least for the moment. The Pemberton estate blazed with light when they arrived, every window glowing gold against the darkness, and the sound of music and conversation spilled out into the cold night air, as footmen helped them from the carriage. Eliza felt the weight of curious eyes the moment she stepped through the great doors, whispers rippling through the assembled guests like wind through tall grass, though she kept her chin lifted and her expression composed, drawing on every lesson her father had taught her about facing fear without flinching. Margaret and Charlotte were already present when they entered the ballroom, standing near the refreshment table in conversation with a cluster of other ladies, and Eliza saw the moment Margaret noticed her arrival, the brief flash of something calculating crossing her stepmother's face before it smoothed into a polite, distant smile. Lady Beatrice found them within a quarter hour, resplendent in emerald silk, her brother Edmund trailing behind her with the same watchful, sharp-eyed presence he always carried. Your Grace, Miss Whitmore, Beatrice said, her voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of the nearby guests. How lovely to see you both here this evening. I confess I wondered whether Miss Whitmore would dare to show her face, given the talk that has been circulating. What talk would that be, Lady Beatrice? Alistair asked, his voice deceptively mild. Oh, nothing of consequence, I am sure, Beatrice said, with a small laugh that fooled no one within hearing distance. Only that some find it curious, a young woman with no fortune of her own, no family connections to speak of, residing for weeks in a duke's household. One does begin to wonder at the nature of such an arrangement. The words landed exactly as Beatrice had intended, drawing several nearby heads to turn, conversations pausing mid-sentence as attention shifted toward the small group. Eliza felt her cheeks flush, but before she could summon a response, Alistair's voice cut through the murmuring crowd with cold, deliberate clarity. Miss Whitmore has a fortune of her own, modest though it is, left to her by her late father, a fact her stepmother seems remarkably eager to obscure whenever it is convenient to her purposes, Alistair said, and Eliza saw Margaret's face go rigid across the room, close enough to have heard every word. As for the nature of the arrangement, I would remind you, Lady Beatrice, and any others curious enough to speculate, that I found this woman freezing to death on a public road after her own family abandoned her there. I do not believe there is anything scandalous in refusing to let a person die of exposure. A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the crowd, and Eliza saw more than one guest turn toward Margaret with newly critical eyes. Beatrice's composure flickered, clearly having expected a rather different response. Your Grace, I only meant— I know precisely what you meant, Alistair said, his voice quiet now but no less cutting for it. You have spent a considerable amount of effort, Lady Beatrice, attempting to manufacture scandal where none exists, and I confess, I find myself curious as to why a woman of your standing would concern herself so deeply with the private affairs of my household, unless she had some personal interest in the outcome. The implication hung sharp and unmistakable in the air, and Beatrice's face flushed a deep, furious red beneath her careful composure. For a moment, Eliza thought the woman might abandon all pretense entirely, but instead, with visible effort, Beatrice forced her expression back into something resembling pleasant surprise. "You misunderstand me entirely, Your Grace. I only wish to see you protected from those who might seek to take advantage of your generous nature." "My generous nature has never once been in danger from Miss Whitmore," Alistair said. "I begin to wonder whether the same can be said of others in this room." Before Beatrice could formulate a response, Margaret stepped forward, apparently deciding that a change of tactic was needed. "Your Grace, please, this is hardly the place for such a discussion. Eliza is my stepdaughter, and whatever disagreements exist between us, I assure you my only concern has ever been for her welfare." "Your welfare for her extended precisely as far as her carriage seat," Alistair said, "and no further, as I understand it." A few scattered gasps rose from the surrounding guests, and Charlotte, who had been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly found her voice, though it came out sharper and more defensive than she perhaps intended. "You do not understand what it was like," Charlotte said, glaring at Eliza across the small distance between them. "Always the favorite, always father's precious girl, while the rest of us were made to feel like afterthoughts in our own home. Perhaps it would have done you good to understand, just once, what it feels like to be left behind." The words fell into a sudden, terrible silence, an admission far more damning than anything Alistair had yet said, and Eliza saw the color drain from Margaret's face as her daughter's jealousy laid bare, in front of half the county's gentry, exactly what had happened on that storm-swept road. "Charlotte," Margaret hissed, but the damage had already been done. The surrounding guests exchanged glances heavy with new understanding, and Eliza saw, in the sudden shift of expressions around the room, that whatever sympathy Margaret and Charlotte might once have commanded had evaporated entirely. Eliza stepped forward then, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I do not wish for a scene, and I do not wish for either of you to be shamed before your neighbors. I only wish to be left in peace, to build a life that does not depend on your goodwill, which I have learned, at considerable cost, cannot be relied upon." "Eliza, please," Margaret said, her voice dropping, some genuine desperation entering it now as she seemed to realize how thoroughly the evening had turned against her. "We can discuss this privately, surely, away from all these eyes." "There is nothing left to discuss, Mother," Eliza said quietly, and the word mother carried a weight of finality that made Margaret flinch. "You left me to die in the snow. I do not think there is any private conversation that can undo that." She turned then to Beatrice, who had retreated somewhat into the background during the exchange between Eliza and her stepmother, though her sharp eyes still tracked every development with careful attention. "As for you, Lady Beatrice," Eliza said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice, "I do not know what you hope to accomplish this evening, but I think you have accomplished rather the opposite. I wish you good fortune in finding whatever it is you are truly searching for, though I suspect it is not to be found in tearing down a stranger who has done you no harm." Beatrice's mouth opened, then closed again, apparently finding no adequate response to offer, and after a moment, she turned on her heel and withdrew into the crowd, her brother following close behind, with what Eliza thought might have been the faintest hint of amusement on his otherwise unreadable face. Alistair stepped closer to Eliza's side, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even through the space between them, and when he spoke, his voice had lost its cold, cutting edge entirely, replaced by something far gentler. "You did not need my defense at all in the end," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "You are quite capable of defending yourself. I would not have found the courage to stand here at all, if not for you," Eliza said honestly. "You gave me somewhere safe to stand from." Margaret and Charlotte had already begun making their way toward the doors, their departure hastened by the weight of every disapproving glance in the room, and Eliza felt, watching them go, not triumph exactly, but something quieter and more settled, a sense that a chapter of her life that had caused her nothing but pain had finally, truly closed. The musicians, who had faltered briefly during the confrontation, resumed their playing, and the ballroom slowly returned to its usual rhythm of conversation and dance, though Eliza noticed that the glances now directed her way carried something closer to sympathy and quiet respect than the curious speculation of before. "Would you do me the honor of a dance, Miss Whitmore?" Alistair asked, extending his hand with a formality that could not quite disguise the warmth beneath it. Eliza looked at him, at the man who had ridden through a storm to save her life, and stood beside her through every storm since, and felt something long frozen within her own chest begin, at last, to thaw. "I would be glad to, Your Grace," she said, and placed her hand in his. Spring came slowly to Blackwood Hall, the snow retreating first from the gardens and then from the wider fields beyond, until the estate that Eliza had first seen buried under a blanket of white revealed itself in shades of green and gold she had not known to imagine during those long winter weeks. She had remained at the hall through the season's turning, first as a guest whose circumstances no one quite knew how to name, and then, as the weeks passed and the truth of her situation settled comfortably into the household's rhythm, as something that felt increasingly like a permanent resident of a place she had begun, quietly and without quite meaning to call home. The morning after the assembly at Pemberton House, word had spread through the county with the speed such stories always seem to travel, and within days, Eliza found that the whispers following her name had changed their character entirely. Where once there had been curious speculation about scandal, now there was quiet admiration for a young woman who had survived abandonment and found the courage to stand against those who had wronged her, and a growing respect, grudging in some quarters and genuine in others, for the Duke who had defended her so openly. Lady Beatrice Sinclair had not called at Blackwood Hall again. Eliza heard, through the gentle gossip of Mrs. Fenwick and the other servants, that Beatrice had withdrawn to her brother's estate for several weeks following the assembly, and had returned only quietly, her ambitions toward the Duke apparently and permanently abandoned in favor of quieter pursuits elsewhere. Margaret had written once more, a brief and stilted letter that arrived some weeks after the assembly, offering neither apology nor explanation, only a cold acknowledgement that Eliza's inheritance would be released to her fully upon her upcoming birthday, as the law required, and that no further contact would be necessary between them unless Eliza wished it. Eliza had read the letter once, felt the old ache of a childhood spent trying and failing to earn her stepmother's affection, and then set it aside with something that felt, for the first time, like genuine peace rather than grief. She did not write back. Some doors, she had come to understand, were better left closed. Charlotte, curiously, had sent a single line some months later, brief and unsigned beyond her initials, offering something that might charitably be called an apology, though it read more like an admission wrung out under private guilt than any real reconciliation. Eliza kept the note, though she did not respond to that one either. She was not yet ready to forgive, and she had decided, with her father's old lessons echoing in her memory, that forgiveness offered before it was truly felt served no one, least of all herself. Through all of this, Alistair remained a steady, quiet presence at her side, and as spring deepened into early summer, Eliza found that the walls she had first met in him, the cold formality that had seemed so impenetrable during those first days at Blackwood Hall, had worn away almost entirely, revealing a man of surprising warmth and dry humor, fiercely protective of those he had let close enough to matter. It was on a warm evening in early June, as they walked together through the rose garden that had seemed so bleak and skeletal in the depths of winter, now bursting with color and fragrance, that Alistair stopped beside the same fountain where they had first spoken honestly with one another, all those months before. "Do you remember this place?" he asked, and there was something almost nervous in his voice, an uncertainty she had rarely heard from him. "I remember it very well," Eliza said, smiling. "You told me the gardens were bleak in winter, and I told you I did not mind bleak things." "I have thought of that conversation often since," he said, turning to face her fully. "I think it was the moment I first understood that I did not wish to remain as guarded as I had convinced myself I needed to be. You walked into my life in the middle of a storm, Eliza, and I do not think I have felt the cold quite the same way since." Eliza's heart quickened, and she found she could not quite trust her voice to answer, so she simply waited, watching him with an openness that would have felt impossible only months before. "I know that I am not an easy man to love," Alistair continued, reaching for her hand with a gentleness that belied the nervous tension in his shoulders. "I have spent 2 years teaching myself to want very little from the world, for fear of losing it again. But I find that I want a great many things now, and all of them, I have come to realize, involve you." He knelt then, there beside the fountain, where roses climbed once more toward the summer sun, and Eliza felt tears gather in her eyes, not from grief this time, but from something far warmer and fuller than grief had ever been. "Eliza Whitmore, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you stay, not as a guest sheltering from a storm, but as the mistress of this house, and of whatever remains of my heart?" "Yes," Eliza said, before he had even finished speaking, laughing through her tears as he rose to sweep her into his arms. "Yes, Alistair, of course, yes." They were married in late summer, in a small ceremony at the village church near Blackwood Hall, attended by tenants and staff who had come to love Eliza in her months among them, and by a scattering of neighboring families who had watched, with quiet approval, as the cold Duke of local legend had transformed into a man visibly, undeniably happy. Neither Margaret nor Charlotte attended, though Eliza found she did not miss their presence at all, surrounded as she was by people who had chosen, freely and without obligation, to care for her. Mrs. Fenwick cried through the entire ceremony, and confided afterward to anyone who would listen that she had known, from the very first night the Duke had carried a half-frozen stranger through the doors of Blackwood Hall, that something significant had begun. Samuel, the old coachman who had once been forced to leave Eliza behind in the storm, sent a letter of his own some weeks later, having heard the news through the scattered channels of servant gossip, expressing a relief so genuine that Eliza found herself forgiving him entirely, understanding at last that his hands, unlike Margaret's, had never truly been free to act otherwise. As the first snow of the following winter began to fall over Blackwood Hall, nearly a full year after the storm that had changed everything, Eliza stood at the window of what was now her own bedroom, watching the white flakes drift silently down over the gardens below, and felt none of the old fear that winter had once carried for her. Alistair came to stand beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist as they watched the snow together, and she leaned into the warmth of him without hesitation, without the careful guardedness that had once governed every interaction between them. "Do you ever think of that night?" she asked quietly. "The storm, the road, everything that happened before you found me?" "Every time it snows," Alistair admitted. "I think of how close I came to riding past that gatepost without stopping, how close the world came to losing you, before I ever had the chance to know you." "But you did stop," Eliza said, turning to look up at him. "You did find me." "I did," he agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, "and I intend to spend the rest of my life being grateful that I did." Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady, covering the gardens in the same white blanket that had once nearly taken everything from her. But inside Blackwood Hall, the fires burned bright and warm, and Eliza Whitmore, who had once been abandoned on a frozen road by the very people who should have protected her, stood safe and cherished in the arms of the man who had refused to leave her behind, and understood, at last, what it truly meant to be home.